Hello crafty friends, do you like the idea of adding stitching to your cards but you're not quite sure where to start? Well, today I've got a whole bunch of ideas for you. First of all, we're going to look at real stitching, then we're going to look at faux stitching, then we're going to look at stitching guides, and after that I'll show you some cards that I've made with stitching. Right, let's crack on with real stitching. It's really straightforward. Take some craft foam, take a strong piece of card. If you haven't got a fairly thick piece of card, you can always stick two thin pieces together. Put your card on the craft foam and then use a pokey tool to poke some holes in your card. The craft foam is just there so that the pokey tool has something to poke through the card into. And once you've poked the number of holes you want, you can thread a needle and stitch through them just as you would on material. So in this example, all I did was poke a roughly straight line of holes with a poker tool. This actually came with a We Are Memory Keepers bookbinding tool, and it's designed for piercing paper. I then took 3 strands from a 6-strand embroidery thread, threaded my needle, and then stitched all the way up the line and all the way back again. I used 3 strands because I find it easier to sew on paper with 3 strands rather than 6, but you can use as many strands as you like. I didn't tie knots in the ends of my threads. To secure them, I just used a bit of washi tape on the back of the panel. If you don't fancy poking holes yourself, you can get dies that cut the holes for doing embroidery. So I've got a circular embroidery die here. I popped it in the middle of my panel, stuck it down with some washi to stop it shifting around, ran it through my die cutting machine, removed the washi, and then I had a lovely circle of holes that I could then stitch through. I did actually use the full 6 strands for this stitching because the holes are quite large and easy to get a larger eyed needle through, so 6 strands worked just fine for this one. And instead of a running stitch, I did a cross stitch. I do fill this whole circle up off camera, and I'll show you the card I made with it at the end of the video. You can get different shape embroidery dies. I've got this circle, a square, a rectangle and a heart, I think. Again, on this one, I didn't knot my thread on the back. I secured it with washi tape. I did tuck the needle and the thread underneath the back of the stitches so that that tail of the stitching wasn't floating around and visible through the holes. One of my favourite ways to add real stitching to cards is to use my sewing machine. I picked this one up from the works for about £25. I think it was on special offer because one of the dust covers was missing, but I wasn't bothered about that and it was an absolute bargain. And I use it exclusively for paper because I am not a seamstress. The last time I tried to make a garment on a sewing machine, I was probably about 13 and I was at secondary school and I wasn't very successful at it then. The clothes I made were incredibly wonky, but I don't mind a bit of wonky stitching on my cards. So all I did for this example was take a bit of craft card, adhere it with some tape runner to a panel of smooth white card, and then I did 3 very wonky rows of stitching along each edge of the craft card, and that gave me a nice messy frame. Obviously, if you're a better sewer than I am, you can be as neat and tidy or as ornate as you like. So that's the basics of real stitching. Let's look at faux stitching now, and faux stitching just means the look of stitching, not real stitching. So for this first way, all you need is a die with some stitching detail on it. You can use that die to emboss the stitching onto card. You need to use your embossing sandwich with your die cutting machine. So I've got a double stitched rectangle die here. I taped it onto a piece of card, ran it through my die cutting machine with my embossing sandwich, and it hasn't cut the card, it's just pressed the pattern into the card. You can obviously die cut with a die that has some stitching in it. So this double stitching die stitches around the outside of the cut line and the inside of the cut line. So the bit in the middle gets faux stitching and the bit around the outside also gets faux stitching. If that level of faux stitching isn't pronounced enough for you, you can take a pen, any colour you like, or a pencil, and run it along those embossed stitches, just as I'm doing here. I think I went round 2 or 3 times. And if you use a fine enough pen, it can actually look like thread because of the way the pen judders as it goes over those embossed stitch marks. In a similar vein, you can run a pen over holes that you've pierced yourself. Do that a few times, add a little squiggle over the end, and it can look quite realistic. And there's always the option to simply draw by hand. I've got a ruler here just to keep my line vaguely straight, and I'm creating what looks like running stitch, and you can draw any kind of stitch. You don't have to do straight lines, you can do whatever shape you like. The advantage of hand drawing them is that you can do whatever shape you like. If you're not into drawing, you could try using some stitching stamps. I've been collecting these over the years because I love the look of stitching, and the advantage of using stitching stamps is that you can do all the techniques such as heat embossing that you can do with stamps. And the images are reproducible and quick to do. So I've got here some long ones, some short ones, some circular ones, cross stitch, zigzag stitch, running stitch, heart-shaped stitch patterns, star-shaped stitch patterns. They're really versatile, and I particularly enjoy using these on mixed media backgrounds to give the impression of stitching, that visual texture that gives you. As well as stitching stamps, I love stitching embossing folders, and I've got a few. I've got this swirly whirly running stitch, which I often use with insects because I think it reminds me of the trail of a butterfly through the air. I've got a cross stitch one, and I think the big one to the left looks more like knitting, but I think it still counts as stitching. But you can use embossing folders to emboss stitched patterns, and then you can use a variety of techniques to highlight those stitches. So I put some Distress Oxide on my gel plate and used that to get a good layer on my brayer, and then I carefully rolled that across my embossed piece of card, and the stitching and the edges of the card grabbed onto the ink and gave me a really lovely stitching grungy panel. Another fun tool for adding faux stitching is a dressmaker's tracing wheel. I've never used one for its intended purposes, but you can just press it onto some card that you've put on foam, so it's got a bit of give, and roll it along, and it will make stitching type lines on your card. You can run it along the edge of a ruler if you want a straighter line, or you can go really wonky. The trick is not to press too hard because you might pierce the paper in an unattractive way. The idea for using a tracing wheel actually came after I shared my fuse tool idea as a short back in December 23, I think it was. Several people said to me that you can do something very similar with a dressmaker's tracing wheel. So I went and got one, and they were absolutely right. You can use a fuse tool or you can use a tracing wheel. If you've got a printer at home, you can always print out some stitching. I created these stitched frames in PowerPoint, printed them onto some linen textured card in a grey ink. I then chopped them down with my trimmer, beveled the edges with my beveling tool, and then they're ready to go on a card. If you'd like me to make a video about how I did this in PowerPoint, then do let me know and I can do that for you. Right, that's lots of ways of adding faux stitching. Now we're going to look at stitch guides, things that help you get your stitches in the right place. So the most obvious one is use a ruler, and the advantage of using a ruler is that it will have probably marks on it for centimetres or inches, and then you can space your holes fairly evenly. So in this example, I'm using my T-square ruler, my pokey tool, and some card on my craft foam. Another way to get straight lines of stitching is to use a bookbinding tool. This is one from We Are Memory Keepers. You clamp your paper between the guide and the base, and then you can poke holes in the plastic, and that will give you perfectly spaced, perfectly straight lines. You don't have to use it with the base, you can just use the plastic guide on its own like I'm doing here. You can also create see-through guides by poking holes in acetate. I had my bookbinding tool out, so I decided to use that, but you can poke holes in acetate in any design you want. And now I've got a piece of acetate with a straight line of evenly spaced holes. I can now use this anywhere on a piece of card and poke holes wherever I want them, and I can see where I'm doing it because it's see-through, and I don't have to get my bookbinding tool out. Another thing you can use as a guide for your stitching holes is an embroidery die or die cut that you've cut with an embroidery die and a pokey tool. So I've got my rectangular embroidery die here, and I'm pushing my pokey tool through the holes, through some card, on top of some craft foam. And if you want a bit more of a visualization of what you're trying to achieve, you can take a permanent marker like a Sharpie and draw your pattern on the back of an embroidery die like this. And then you'll know which holes you want to poke through. And you can get the Sharpie off just by using some rubbing alcohol. So for this example, I've drawn a 3-tier cake on the back of my die, and I've poked holes all around the edges of the tiers of the cake, and I'll show you how this finished up at the end of the video. Another stitching guide you can use is any die or any die cut. So I've cut myself a heart out of craft coloured cardstock, and I've temporarily adhered that to my card panel so it doesn't shift. I've then placed my card panel on my craft foam and used my pokey tool to go all the way around the outside. When doing something like this, it's important to make sure you've poked a hole in the corners where you want your stitches to turn so that you get the right shape. So I made sure on my heart that I had a hole on the bottom point of the heart and on the top point where it dips down in the middle. And that way I know the stitches are going to form the shape properly. Stamped images can be great stitching guides. So I've got a stamp here and I've inked it up with a light grey ink. I stamped it off to the side first to take some of the ink off, and then I stamped a very faint image where I wanted to stitch. Once the ink was dry, which doesn't take long, you can then get your pokey tool and poke some holes and do your stitching. And because the ink that's there is very faint, it's not going to show through your stitching. If you're comfortable with drawing, you can draw your own designs. So I'm very lightly drawing a large flower shape here. I can then put my panel of card on my craft foam and poke holes all the way around the lines that I've drawn in the shape of a flower, and then I can stitch. If you want, you can use an eraser to remove the pencil lines before you stitch, but normally you'll cover them up with the stitches. I do apologise for the beeping noise in the background. It's my frogs. I don't know what's the matter with them this evening. They just won't be quiet. Way back when I was in the Girl Guides, we used to do some embroidery, and we used to use this plastic canvas. We called it Binker, but I think that's a brand name, but it's just a kind of plastic embroidery canvas. And this is a great guide. It is basically a grid of holes, and you can go to town poking holes wherever you want them really easily, and it's pretty see-through so you can see where you're poking them. As well as printing out stitches, as we talked about earlier, you can print out stitching guides. So I just made some shapes in PowerPoint, printed them off, cut them out with a pair of scissors, and then went around them with my pokey tool. There are lots of resources on the internet. If you're not au fait with something like PowerPoint for creating things, then you can find free images, free embroidery patterns, free shapes that you can download, print at home, and then use as guides for your stitching on your cards. Of course, you don't have to cut the shapes out with scissors. You can just put the piece of paper on top of your card and then poke along the printed line. Do whatever works for you. Stencils and masks can make handy stitching guides. I've got a stencil here with a triangle pattern on it, and I'm using my pokey tool to make holes around the edges of a few triangles. Right, that's all the ideas. Let's look at some finished cards. So I made this card using this die, and I did lots of rows of cross stitch in different colours to fill up my circle. Then I popped that behind a panel with some faux stitching on it, added a faux stitched frame, and then a celebrate sentiment on top. The stitching on this really is the star of the show. It's texturally different from everything around it, colourfully different. It's lots of different straight lines of crosses as opposed to everything else that's kind of curved, circular or loopy on the card. Here's that panel that I made on the sewing machine, those 3 wonky rows of stitches to create a frame. I put a die cut that I coloured in this bottom corner here with some leaves. You can still see some of the stitching poking out. And then diagonally opposite, I placed the Hope Your Day Blooms with Happiness die cut. And again, the stitching comes out from underneath that. So although these two elements are quite separate, the stitching connects them. I use the same die cuts on this one, but the panel I made by using a die to emboss stitching, and then I die cut it out with another stitched rectangle die, and then I blended on some Distress Oxides to bring out the stitching, both the stitching on the edge and the stitching from the embossing. I spattered on some gold and then did that diagonal opposite again. So there's no actual real stitching on this one, just some embossed stitching that connects the two corners. For this one, I die cut out a panel from linen textured cardstock using a stitched rectangle die, and then I used a pen to draw several lines over the embossed stitching so it looks like it's been sewn with a fine black thread, but in reality it hasn't. So we've got some faux stitching there. And the paper here, the black with a bit of gold on it and this gold with a bit of black on it, was some of those papers I brought with me back from Japan. So on this one, I mixed and matched my techniques. I stamped a purple stitched arc for my rainbow. Then I did a running stitch in a pale blue. Then I used some acrylic brush markers to do a kind of faux chain stitch. Then I stamped a green running stitch. Then I sewed using pale yellow thread a zigzag stitch. I stamped on an orange cross stitch, and then I did half zigzags in actual pink thread. So we've got stamping, drawing and actual sewing. And especially for you in the corner there. Here we have that piece I did with the embossing folder. I added some more ink around the edge just to bring in a bit of extra texture and depth. I then die cut a craft card butterfly, pierced some holes with my pokey tool and did a running stitch around the edge in pink and mint. So the stitches alternate in colour. I popped that up on some craft foam and I added a happy birthday across the front. This is very clean and simple. I took some hexagons from my spare die cuts box. I ran them through my cross stitch embossing folder and then I dragged some ink over them to highlight that embossing. I arranged them here straight on the card blank and then die cut out some sewing themed icons using a matte gold and popped them on. So we've got a sewing machine, some scissors, some thread, and then added a happy birthday there. Could add some splatters to bring in a bit more energy. I made this Christmas card with some Christmas trees from my box of leftovers. I spattered on some gold onto one of those bits of card that I printed some faux stitching onto. I used washi tape for the trunks and I die cut some gold sequins, star shapes. I will put a Merry Christmas up here, I think. I just haven't got access to my Christmas box at the moment. So this cake card I made by stitching on that cake shape that I made by drawing the cake shape on the back of this die and then poking holes. So I just stitched from left to right in the different colours all the way down and then from top to bottom, so I've got a bit of a grid. And then I added some single long and short stitches for the candles and stamped "Have the happiest day." As a guide to poke the holes in this one, I used that craft coloured heart die cut and I did a pink chain stitch all the way round. I decided to turn it into a shaker card, so I used another heart die to cut an aperture. I backed it with acetate, put some copper glitter circles in and then backed that with a bit from my box of backgrounds and bits. And then I put "Sending love from all of us" across the front. So we've got stitching and shaking going on there. Again, you could add some spatters or some drops or some enamel dots for a bit more something around it. For this card, I stamped those petal shapes and I did chain stitch again. I did yellow, pink and green just for something in the background. I added a gold leafy die cut and a happy birthday. So that's pretty clean and simple. Could definitely jazz it up a bit. For this card, I took a panel that I'd cut with a stitched rectangle die, and then I used the plastic canvas to poke holes in it in a few grid areas. And I wanted this just to be background texture. So I've got a little block here, 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 a single one down there, one there, there's some peeking out there and there. And then I added a cluster of flowers from my box of bits and a sending hugs. So this really is just a bit of interesting visual texture. On this one, I've simply got a stitched rectangle, which I thought would make a nice frame for this panel here that I cut from a bit left over from a previous project. I cut the panel with the stitching on down to create another panel. And then I added a silver flower, a blue butterfly that I'd backed with vellum. I gave it some crystal glaze for its body and added a few white Nouveau drops and a sentiment. So I think the stitching on this makes a lovely frame. On this card I used a stencil to make my pokey holes, and I did messy stitching in the triangles to fill up the triangles to create lots of visual texture. They just make a nice landing spot for my focal point butterfly. And I've got here a vellum flower, a pinky purple glitter butterfly with some shimmery blue bits on it. I added crystal glaze to the body, a sending hug sentiment and some Nouveau drops. And then we got one last card, and I thought I can't do a stitching video without including buttons of some kind. So I took 3 pieces of coloured cardstock, mounted them on some sticky foam. I then die cut out some buttons, which I then stuck on this panel here with the faux stitching around the outside. I then used my pokey tool to poke holes through that panel in each of the holes in the buttons. And then I added some gold thread. I did a cross on each button so it looks like they're sewn on, which they are, but they're also stuck on with sticky foam. I then popped it on a card and added a happy birthday in gold on its vellum outline so it didn't cover up too many of the buttons. Obviously you can use real buttons, but I find them quite heavy on the front of cards, so I like my die cut buttons. I did cover the cardstock in clear packing tape to give them a bit of gloss. And there you go, lots of ways to get real and pretend stitching on your cards. It can be the star of the show, or it can be a supporting cast member. I hope you've enjoyed today's video and it's given you at least a few ideas of things you can do with stitching on your cards. If it has, please do let me know in the comments. Please consider leaving a thumbs up. And if you want to see more from me, do subscribe and ring the notification bell. And I'll see you back here very soon for some more hints and tips and tricks. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.